Hello, everybody. In the past, we've done many shows on the dysfunctionality, to use a euphemism, of the American criminal justice system. Done shows last year with Ben Austin, who had an important book out about parole, prison, and the possibility of change, entitled Correction. Then a more personalized story with a woman called Keeda Haynes on her journey from prison to politics. Her book was called Bending the Arc, but we haven't done any shows on the death penalty and the dysfunctionality in that sense of the criminal justice system. My guest today has a new book out, Gianna Toboni, The Volunteer, on the failure of the death penalty in America and one inmate's quest to die with dignity. It's astonishing story, Gianna. Before we get there, is the issue of death row and the capital punishment system in America, how intimately bound up with it is it in the broader dysfunctionality of the American criminal justice system?
Very closely connected. A lot of the biases that we see in the broader criminal justice system, we certainly see with death row. So that involves, things like racial bias and severe mental illness, folks who are on the fringes of society, for lack of a better phrase. I mean, who were raised in, poverty, who didn't have the benefit of childhood sobriety, folks who have head trauma and, may have experienced psychosis, hallucinations as children, people who really just didn't have the benefit of the doubt during their early years. In the death penalty, we certainly see that. The protagonist of my book, frankly, did not fit into that box. He was an outlier in more way than one.
So tell me about, you call him the protagonist, Scott Dozier. Tell me about him.
Well, Andrew, I first wrote him a letter in 2017. Frankly, I just needed an interview with a death row inmate for a documentary that I was doing for a program called Vice on HBO. I didn't know if I'd ever hear back from him. And then I saw my phone light up a few days later and it was him. And that started, a series of conversations that we had for more than a year, on average, a few times a week. And what immediately struck me about this guy is that he wasn't the character that you typically see in media. This wasn't an innocence case. He was a violent offender. The crimes that he was convicted of were completely brutal. And he was volunteering for execution. He was raising his hand. He wrote the judge a letter and he said, let's get this over with. He said, you sentenced me to death, so let's see you do it. In some ways he called the bluff of the state, in their promise to kill him. And, that in conjunction with his personality, in the book, I say his use of profanities was as advanced as his vocabulary. He was just an outlier in more than one way. And I find that fascinating.
Fascinating and disturbing. What crime or crimes did he commit that resulted in him being put to death?
He was convicted of murder in 2 cases. The capital case was in Nevada, the one prior in Arizona. In the Nevada case, he was convicted of killing a man named Jeremiah Miller in a drug deal gone south. And he as the story goes, the body was dismembered, and he was given the death sentence for that. I'd like to note, though, in both cases, there was no DNA evidence. They were both circumstantial.
Now, but did he acknowledge guilt?
He did not. He did not. And so in my conversations with him, of course, I asked him about both cases and, I said, did you do it? And I wanted to know that specifically because they were cases only on circumstantial evidence, but not only that, all of the witnesses they seemed pretty unreliable. I mean, many of them were getting pressured by law enforcement or said that they were. Many of them were on drugs and several of them got deals. They were in prison, they had sentences, and they got deals for flipping on Dozier. And so it wasn't exactly, the strongest cases, particularly for what resulted in a capital sentence. But when I asked him, did you do it? For the Nevada one, he kind of talked around it and he said, look, if you, live in the underworld, if you agree to be in the drug business, you sort of subscribe to the unwritten rules of like anything can happen. When I asked him about the Arizona case, did you do it? He blatantly said, no, I did not kill Jason Green. And that to me suggested that, he probably had something to do in the Nevada case, whether he actually did it or not. He knew about it. He was involved is what I think. The Arizona case, I'm a little skeptical. I'm not sure that he's responsible for that one.
What's your take, Gianna, on capital punishment?
Well, look, growing up in San Francisco, it was always very easy for me to say I'm anti-death penalty, and it ends there, right? I mean, the fact that we even sentence one person to death who is wrongfully convicted, that we have had one innocent person on death row and executed is too many, for me. And the financial part of it, which I'm happy to talk about, never made sense to me. So I was always very comfortable in that position. And then I met Scott Dozier. And I walked death row with him, and I went to his cell and I said, "Why are you volunteering for execution?" And he threw his hands up in his cell and he said, "This is where I live 22 to 24 hours a day," and he was in his 40s and he had probably had another few decades to live. And he said, "This is unacceptable to me. I'd rather be dead than live my life like this." And because he had been sentenced to death, I felt like he should be able to activate that sentence. And that really complicated my view of the death penalty.
So your argument is that you grew up in San Francisco, and in our liberal city, nobody is for the death penalty. But then you met this guy who may or may not have killed someone. You saw how he lived in prison and the fact that he wanted to die. So you changed your mind. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I think in his case, I felt like he should have had that option. I'm still completely and totally disturbed by how shameful this practice is carried out in our country. And I also tried to shake myself out of my comfort zone in the pages of this book by putting myself in the shoes of a parent in Uvalde, Texas, with that school shooting, for instance. And you can never, of course, understand, what it's like to experience the ultimate tragedy as those parents and many others have in this country. But I'm a parent, and that really, I really grappled with my views when I started to think about, experiencing that pain and thinking about what I would want to do, frankly, to the perpetrator in that situation. And that made it, I don't know, that created some internal conflict for me. Now, look, do I think the state should be able to kill citizens the way it's being done now? Absolutely not. But I also don't think that that's for me to decide. I believe in democracy, and I think voters should be able to, decide whether or not this practice is carried out in their name. What I'm pressing voters and politicians to really pay closer attention to is how this is being done in our country, because I think that people conveniently look the other way and just assume people are falling asleep peacefully on, gurneys in these death chambers. And I don't believe that's the case after reporting on this book.
Yeah, there have been some recent horrifying reports of how people were put to death. And you mentioned Uvalde. We did a show a few months ago with the owner of the local newspaper there, who wrote a book about the trauma of that day. Are you suggesting then, I mean, obviously, if you murder someone, you need to be punished. When Dozier said that he wanted to die, was that in a sense an escape from being stuck in a cell for 24 hours a day?
I think it's fair to look at it that way. That was his only shot of ever, I don't know, reaching freedom, to I don't know, and I think that the way that we incarcerate people in America, particularly on death row, and it varies by state, but I think that it's cruel. I don't think that it's what we stand for as Americans, or should stand for. I don't think it's a reflection of our values. I mean, putting someone in a cage for up to 24 hours a day, without eye contact, without human touch. I mean, these are basic human needs that are as important as food and water. And, I think that we are subjecting people to, what is effectively psychological torture. And I don't think that's right. And look, I think what this book taught me and what Dozier taught me is sometimes not getting executed is actually worse than the execution itself.
Yeah, that was my point, that it's a worse punishment. The arguments on the death penalty, obviously, you're all too familiar, much more familiar than I am about it. One of the arguments is that some people guilty of a terrible crime, especially if they were young when they committed that crime, are capable of reform, of changing themselves, of finding God, of recognized that they committed a terribly evil act and spending the rest of their lives trying to, I don't know, give something back. Did you learn that from Dozier? Was he, if he was still alive today, might he have reinvented himself?
I don't know. I thought about that a lot, and he's a persuasive guy. And, there were definitely times where he, not in saying it, he was never saying I could live a law abiding life outside of prison. He was never advocating for himself in that way. But just in talking to him, it absolutely crossed my mind that, hey, with the right programs, with the right support system, maybe this guy could live a law abiding life on the outside. But I will say that people very close to him who knew him, essentially his whole life, were skeptical, did not know if he would be able to do that. I think feared that in that circumstance that he could fall back into the underworld. But in my reporting, I went to places like San Quentin, home to California's death row up until several months ago. And, I met people who were lifers, not on death row, but had sentences of life. And they rehabilitated. And I saw it up close, and I've seen the data, and it's compelling. It's compelling. It shows that with the right programs and, again, the right support system, that folks who are convicted of murder, who have life sentences, are capable of being rehabilitated.
Yeah, and you had an interesting piece recently on CBS News about rehabilitative programs in California. What about? I mean, he sounds like a pretty smart guy in his own way, Scott Dozier. Why did he reach out to you? What was in it for him in all the interviews he did? Some of which were, of course, broadcast and have actually done rather well.
I reached out to him originally. I wrote him a letter and asked him to call me. I said, hey, I want to do an interview.
Yeah, no, I apologize, but he obviously didn't have to get back to you.
Of course. And he was reluctant. It took me weeks of convincing him in order for him to get on board with doing this. And, there were times where he said, I don't know why I'm doing this. I don't have a platform. And then once his execution
What do you mean you don't have a platform?
He didn't have a message. He didn't really care to do the interview, And I was saying, look, here are some reasons why I think it's, worthwhile, and I'm interested in this, this, and this. And once his execution was stayed, and once he found that the state was struggling to find a way to execute him, that was frustrating for him. And then all of a sudden, he had a message. And his message was, look, you said you're going to kill me, so let's see you do it, And so I wouldn't say that he was looking for media attention. I would say that I gave him the opportunity. He took it reluctantly. And then once he felt like he was being mistreated by the state, I think he used this opportunity to call the state out.
Gianna, some people might be listening or watching this and thinking to themselves, this guy was pretty evil. He doesn't deserve the publicity, even if it's he's no longer around. He doesn't deserve the publicity that Gianna Toboni is giving him in The Volunteer. He should have either rot away in jail or die and be forgotten entirely. How would you respond to that kind of criticism?
Well, look, I think Scott Dozier represents a much bigger story, which is how broken our capital punishment system is in America. And I think that's what I use his story for in this book. I use it as an example to show that, among many other things, one, if you have an inmate who is volunteering for execution and you have a state that theoretically, intends to execute him, they've given him the death sentence, you have this shared goal, and yet the execution isn't being carried out. I mean, I think that is a perfect example of how broken this system is. Now, yes, I go into his backstory and, I talk about his life from birth until death. And, from the folks who have read it, they come back to me, across the political spectrum, and they say, look, I have to admit I ended up sympathizing with this guy. And look, what I would say to folks about
sympathizing in what sense?
Well, in the sense that, look, people are complicated, okay? He was convicted of some very brutal acts, but he's also human. And when we sentence people to death, what we're doing is we are saying we are going to execute them in the name of Americans. But what we're not saying is that we are going to, effectively torture them in solitary confinement so badly that their mental health is eroded to a point where they do the job for the state, which is to say that they kill themselves. Okay, that is different than execution. To be putting someone in extensive solitary environments, which the state called suicide watch and mental health observation, but when you see it up close, it's solitary.
So what's the difference, Gianna, between being sentenced to death and this kind of what you call at least torture, solitary confinement, and somebody who is imprisoned for murder and is in solitary confinement? Are the death row inmates dealt with differently?
Absolutely. It differs state to state, and it differs, between death row and general population. But in general, on death row, your movements are much more restricted. That, in Nevada, theoretically, they were supposed to get out of their cells for at least a couple hours a day, but that didn't always happen. And with Scott Dozier in particular, he was put in, as I said, suicide watch and mental health observation. And when you read the book, you understand how different that is from death row. I mean, he is not allowed out of his cell at all. In some cases, he has the lights on 24/7. He doesn't have reading material or anything to listen to or literally anything to do other than look at a white wall. Okay. And that's not what prison is supposed to be, in America. And so, yes, in Texas, if someone visits you, you can't have any contact, right? You can't hold your mom's hand. You can't give them a hug. And look, a lot of Americans would say, great, these people deserve this. But I think people don't actually understand what these conditions look like. In this book, what I try to do is paint a very detailed picture. For Scott's time in solitary, I do a minute by minute description of what it really meant for him to be in solitary and how it impacted him emotionally and mentally.
But he, in a way, I guess, beat the system because he committed suicide. Is that how he might have thought of it? Is that how you think of it?
He didn't want to do that. And he told me that over and over and over again. I mean,
he wanted to be put to death by the state.
Exactly.
And then explain, Gianna, why it took so long. Is this just classic bureaucracy?
Well, look, I think, for one, states, including Nevada, there's no political will to actually carry out these death sentences, right? They continue to sentence people to death, but there are dozens of people who are just sitting on death row and they will never be executed. The last person executed in that state was in 2006, and it was a volunteer. Okay, so that's happening in a lot of states. And so I call into question whether we have the death penalty just to score political points, for prosecutors, or whether we actually want to do the dirty work. I question the latter part of that.
Is it possible to argue that this is such a hard issue, as you've acknowledged, that this gray area between being put to death and just being put in prison is comfortable for everybody?
Sure. I mean, I think that there are stakeholders in every corner of this debate. And I think, for DAs, they get X amount of death sentences. That's good for their career aspirations in many counties in America. But then actually carrying out the execution, there's a lot of risk involved. What if it goes wrong? What if it's botched? Then you're in the headlines as not being able to carry out, one of the most consequential sentences in America. So yes, I mean, for Scott Dozier, though, it was different, to be clear. He was sentenced to death. He volunteered. His first execution was scheduled. And, strangely, his lawyers were arguing that the method of execution, the cocktail of drugs that would be used to kill him, was a violation of the Eighth Amendment. And the judge stayed the execution. Okay. At the second time, it was the drug companies that sued the state that stayed the execution.
Couldn't make this stuff up. But then if he wanted to die, why were his lawyers trying to protect him?
Well, that was the strange thing. It was almost like Dozier and the state were on the same side, and the defense lawyers were kind of arguing against his interests. At least that's how Dozier felt. And so Dozier,
couldn't he just dismiss his lawyer?
Yeah, and he grappled with that, and he kind of threatened that, and after that first execution was stayed, he called me and he said, look, my lawyers are arguing against my best interest. The ACLU is arguing against my best interests. No one has my back in this debate. And I have to say, I also sympathize with his lawyers. Even if they weren't working in their client's best interest, which of course is their obligation, and what Dozier would have argued, they were caught in this, what they called a moral dilemma. They didn't get into this work to walk their client to the death chamber. They got into this work to try to avoid, executions. And so they were in a really tricky position, so much so that one of his lawyers resigned. They got off his team and said, I'm not helping you do this, man.
So what's the moral in The Volunteer? Are you suggesting in when people read the book that the death penalty should be abolished? Or are you simply saying that if you're going to give the death penalty, as Scott Dozier said, do it? Don't wait around. Don't have all these layers of bureaucracy and put it off and put it off and put it off.
Well, yeah, look, I try to press Americans to take as close a look as I have at the death penalty and really ask themselves, in a system where we are only executing 15%, 15% of people sentenced to death, and yet we'll pay as much as 10x for that death sentence compared to life without parole. Why are we doing this? Is this a system that is really functioning in the way that we intend for it to? And the other thing I would ask, in a system where, not being executed is potentially worse than the execution, what does that say about our prison system? And are we okay with that prison system, considering that we are the ones funding it?
Yeah, I have to admit, I'm not convinced by this idea of it being worse. I mean, that's obviously.
Think about it though. And
hopefully, I will never be in the situation where I can make a judgment on that. But go on.
Yeah, let me paint a picture for you. You're in a 9-foot by 5-foot cell for up to 22 in many days and days in a row, 24 hours a day. You're not making eye contact with people. You don't have, not as much as a fist bump with someone, right? And in some cases, right, with Scott Dozier, for instance, you don't have reading material, right? You don't have TV, you don't have radio, you don't have anything to listen to. You don't have access to the phone. In some cases, you don't have access to your lawyer or your family. You start to go crazy, right? Would you prefer to be executed, or would you prefer to live, like that for decades on end?
How did you get to talk to him then if you didn't have access to phone?
So I talked to him, for instance, the morning before he went into solitary, when he got out of solitary. But then, there were a couple times where at night, a sympathetic guard would slip him the phone and say, hey, man, this is really messed up. What's happening to you? And he'd give him the phone and he'd call me. Those guards would also call me and say, hey, this is what I'm seeing. I don't want to be outed as a whistleblower, but this is really messed up. So we talked a lot before and after the stints in solitary, but on occasion he would get slipped the phone.
And when you say stints in solitary, were there times where he wasn't in solitary, when he was on death row?
Yes.
And what explains why at times he was in solitary and why at times he wasn't?
Well, this is contested, but what Dozier would say, let me start with the state. The state put him in solitary after, and I call it solitary. They call it suicide watch and mental health observation. They put him in suicide watch after the executions were stayed, purportedly to prevent his suicide. What it did, though, according to Dozier, is it deeply eroded his mental health and led him toward taking his own life. Okay. Several months after, he went into solitary confinement, was stripped in his cell, taken out and into the infirmary, into these suicide watch and then mental health observation cells, which I described, have no coping mechanisms, no reading material or phone access, and so on. And the reason the state said that they put him in there was because they had 2 investigations going on at once. This is their version of the story, which is documented, which I got these documents in FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act. One of the investigations dealt with he had been coordinating with someone on the outside to get a drug sent to him. Okay, the state thought that it was a drug that he would use to kill himself. What all parties involved have told me is that it was a recreational drug that he was just using to, get high. The second investigation revolved around his sister sending him drawings, anatomy drawings. And, it was an anatomy drawing that showed what would happen if you killed yourself a certain way. Now, his sister says, and she never wanted him to die by suicide, is that she was sending him these sketches in order to show him that he could not kill himself in this way. What the state took it as was that she was showing him how to kill himself in this way. And so what they said with both of these instances, they said, we're putting you, in suicide watch. Scott thought that it was retaliation. He thought the state was retaliating against him for being a loudmouth, for embarrassing the state. We had done our interview where he called out, the state and embarrassed them, and it was racking up millions of views by the time, he was put into solitary. Not to mention, I was interviewing all of his friends on death row at the time.
Did you ever have any scruples again? I mean, you put it on Vice News. You were a long time journalist at Vice. I mean, this just had millions of views.
It had millions of views. And it wasn't until I really put the timeline together afterward and started thinking about, okay, I was interviewing that inmate, and they were talking about the poor conditions and the mistreatment by the state. And once I started lining all these things up, I thought, they may have been retaliating against him. There were also some internal documents that I came across that made me feel like, that could be a good theory. I mean, one of the guards called me and said as much. He said that they don't like that he's doing all this media. That's why they're doing this. That's why they're putting him in there.
Who are they? You mean the senior people within the prison system?
There was one guard who called me and told me that was his opinion, and a second guard that I interviewed later who said the same thing. In addition to that, there was a medical provider who was working in the prison who was overseeing, Dozier's treatment in these solitary cells, and she said, based on the contemporaneous notes I was able to get access to, "You're not the star anymore, Dozier. You're not the star." And that to me suggested, okay, what does she mean? You're not the star anymore. What makes someone a star? I think it's probably being on YouTube and getting 10 million views.
Yeah, we did a show last week with Brian Goldstone's written a book about people who are working and homeless, and he talks about their invisibility, that people don't know about them. So in contrast, Scott Dozier is well known, but he was, as you acknowledge, I guess, I mean, I'm not sure whether you'd be comfortable with these terms, an evil criminal. What made him such a bad man? I mean, he was in the military, so he didn't necessarily grow up with the kind of narrative that would lead him to become a man who was accused of double murder.
As I say in the book, I really don't subscribe to the sort of Hollywood version of how people, land on death row, for instance. I don't think it's ever as simple as, oh, he tortured animals in his backyard when he was a kid. With Dozier, it was, a really complex set of circumstances that I outline in, 3 or 4 chapters. And so it's complicated. But when he was a kid, he had a very healthy home life. He grew up in a middle-class family in the American West. They moved every 2 years. And at some point, as he, got closer to middle school, he started acting out a little bit. There was one time where he landed in a new town. He didn't fit in at all. And he came home completely drunk, and he was all of 11, 12 years old. And his mom was just stunned. There was another time where he got arrested again at a very young age. And the cops started throwing all kinds of charges against him, things he actually wasn't responsible for. He didn't actually live in the city when those crimes were being committed. And it instilled this deep mistrust of law enforcement. When he was an Army Ranger, he learned how to kill, right? And people close to him cite that as one of the factors. When he moved to Vegas in his 20s, he started building this meth empire, and then he started using meth himself. And I think meth is the one that probably did him in.
So I take your point that you spend a few chapters in the new book, The Volunteer, on this, but how would you summarize it? I mean, when we think about creating a society where there are fewer Scott Doziers, what can we learn from this story?
I think a lot of, with Dozier's, again, it's complicated, but I think that drugs have, drugs like meth, and now we have a different version of meth circulating in some cities, including San Francisco, which, is referred to as this super meth. It deprives people of sleep. It creates psychosis. It can make people violent, and I mean, look, we've had warnings on drugs forever. I think that's clearly not the only thing that's wrong with his story, but I think that he just had a unique set of circumstances, and I think that there are a lot of lessons woven throughout his story.
Should we mourn Scott Dozier? I mean, do you mourn him?
I mean, sure. Look, I think that when you have somebody who was mistreated by their government, in a way that is not part of the system. This is not how the system is supposed to work. And they are forced, essentially to kill themselves, right? Instead of the state executing him. Yeah, I think we should mourn him. I mean,
When you say forced, I mean, how many other examples are there of people like Scott Dozier on death row who commit suicide?
I mean, the suicide rate for people on death row is much higher than it is for general population.
What is that rate? I mean, it's
I think it's 10x general population.
So what does that mean in
I mean, that's a ton more people. And I think the reason is because these solitary environments create these symptoms of psychosis. I mean, I think that they really impact people. I think they make people more depressed. I think they enhance anxiety to a point where, people feel that it's actually better to take their own life than it is to live in this environment. And a lot of this stuff is documented, and I think it shouldn't come as a surprise to people, right? That leading medical associations have talked about the impact of solitary. I think this is probably one of the least surprising things about this book when you talk about the impact of solitary confinement on folks who have been subjected to it to extensive periods of time.
So when you say forced, you're really suggesting that the state, in this context at least, or this example, was guilty of the murder of Scott Dozier.
Well, that's what he would say, and that's what he did say to me. I mean,
but are you agreeing with him?
Yeah. I mean, I think the way that he outlined it for me in the weeks leading up to his death, he said that. He said, the state is making me suicidal. I was not suicidal before they put me in this environment, and now I live in fear of going back into that environment, and I cannot handle that, right? So he said it, right? I don't have to guess. He said it. He told me that, and those words are in the book.
Does he personalize it at all when he talks about, quote unquote, the state? Were there particular judges or lawyers or prison officials that he thought were guilty of killing him, of making him suicidal?
Well, he doesn't put it in those words. No, I mean, he, as you'll know if you read the book, he has this relationship with the warden that is contentious, and it's contentious because he feels like the warden is after him. But then he stops blaming the warden at some point because he feels like the warden is just following orders. And there's a health professional who is involved in his care, so-called care, but who he has a good relationship with, and who tells him, look, I have no power here. These orders are coming from the director. They're coming from the governor, right? So you're talking about people who are in very high political offices here, who this person on the mental health team is saying, we can't do anything about this because we are being directed from the top. And he actually wrote that in some contemporaneous notes that I got access to. Now, I will say that he then went back on that when he had to submit an affidavit, months later. He went back on that and said, actually, we weren't being directed by anyone. We were doing what we thought was in the best interest of this inmate.
These kind of stories often have a religious component. Often people on death row find God one way or the other. Was there any of that in the Scott Dozier case?
No, but I agree with you. No, he wasn't religious, but there, of the folks that I've met on death row, many of them are religious, and that's very helpful to them. That gives them hope.
Well, finally, Gianna, it's such a troubling story and such an important one. Congratulations on the book. What have you learned on human life itself? I mean, it's so complicated because, of course, Dozier was put to life for taking the lives, supposedly, of two other people. But what have you learned about the value of human life from the work you've done and from writing The Volunteer? How has it changed? And it sounds like in a way it's changed your life as well, that call you once made, or that attempt to talk to Dozier.
Well, Andrew, when I met one death row inmate in Texas, this is not Scott Dozier, I was I was emotional about the crime that he committed. He had killed a child and his partner, and I saw that guy as a monster and nothing else. And when I met him and when I heard about his childhood and when I started to understand him as a human being, I started to look at his story from the time he was born, not the time he committed the crime. I realized that we have to look at people in a holistic way. And I think that we have to, consider that folks on the fringes of society, have gotten to that place for a reason. And I think that we could all use a little bit more compassion when dealing with these folks, whether they're people living on the street addicted to meth or people on death row.
Well, Gianna Toboni, the author of The Volunteer, I'm not sure I want to congratulate you for the book. I wish you didn't have the need to write it, but it's out there. It's an important book. The failure of the death penalty in America and one inmate's quest to die with dignity. Some people might argue that he had no right to die with dignity, but it's an important and controversial issue, complicated. So, Gianna, congratulations on the book, and I'd love to get you back on the show in the not too distant future. You do lots of interesting work on many fronts in the United States.